My work is focusing on the effects of pesticides on biodiversity. I work with all kinds of taxa, with amphibians, bees, other insects, plants, and currently evaluating exposure in the environment. Amphibians populations generally are going down, so they are reducing in individual numbers, or they are also disappearing from the landscape. This is not only true for the very threatened species, but also for the so-called common species like the European common toad or the European grass frog. Amphibians are very sensitive to pesticides, and they encounter pesticides also in two environments, which is unusual for all the rest of the organisms that we consider in registration, regulation, and in risk assessment. They come in contact in the terrestrial environment, but also in the aquatic environment with pesticides, and therefore they are threatened in both environments, and they are sensitive in the aquatic environment, similar as fish, but also in the terrestrial, and specifically in the terrestrial because their skin properties are completely different if you compare them to other animals like birds or mammals. Because birds and mammals, they have a skin that basically isolates the organism from the environment, whereas an amphibian has a skin that is communicating with the environment. So there is an exchange of water, of gases, of oxygen. It's a breathing organ as well. And therefore, the uptake of pesticides is also dramatically faster in amphibians compared to other vertebrates. I mean, when you think about this terrestrial exposure, it was amazing to see a couple of years ago that basically there are no tests available that ever studied what happens if you expose an amphibian to spray, to pesticide spray. And we mimicked this, therefore, in a laboratory test. And we could see that independent of the use type of an insecticide, herbicide, or fungicide, we saw a high mortality within a couple of days. Mortality is up to 100% in our test individuals. In a more recent study that was just published, actually, we studied a different scenario in a vineyard where frogs were exposed to a fungicide, and the fungicide was on the ground. So the assumption is the tractor is spraying a fungicide in a vineyard. There is a certain concentration in the soil, and then amphibians are moving on that substrate. And also in this study, we observed mortality, and I have to say this is especially important to note because the fungicide that we use is Folpet, and Folpet is the most common used fungicide after sulfur in Germany, at least. On the European scale, there are a protected group of species everywhere. So not only their habitat might be protected, but the group of amphibians is protected because they are recognized as the group that is on a global scale under a very high threat level, the highest in all vertebrates, actually. So they are protected, but the pesticide regulation, in contrast, is not including amphibians so far. There was a scientific opinion published by the EFSA in 2019, but since then nothing happened actually. So it's still not necessary to conduct a risk assessment for amphibians. I don't think that the risk assessment will ever be able to protect amphibians because the main fundamental mistakes in the risk assessment consider, the registration is based on one substance, whereas all the amphibians encounter mixtures of substances. And they are moving inside the field, so they encounter also high concentrations. This is all not covered in a risk assessment. I therefore think it's only possible to reduce pesticide use. On a general level, I think we need to avoid spraying of pesticides. We don't need too much research because we know enough that the pesticides are highly toxic for amphibians. And So we unfortunately don't have the time to now study for 10 years and then consider for 10 years how we change the risk assessment, because in 10 or 20 years the amphibian populations might be gone in Central Europe.